Hello, my name is Eli Hawkins, and in the Society for Creative Anachronism, I go by the name Cadfan of the Autumn Wood. And today I'm going to be discussing archery in the SCA, but more specifically, I'm going to focus on arrow construction and how a lot of people in the SCA create the arrows that they use. First off, we'll discuss the bows. Now, a lot of people in the SCA will use a recurve bow like this. The spirit of archery in the SCA is one of inclusiveness, and a recurve bow like this really allows a lot of people to have access to our hobby that otherwise might not. These are relatively affordable, and you can find them in a lot of places. This particular kind is what's known as a takedown recurve. It has these knobs here for the top and bottom limb, and you can actually detach those for easy storage. Or you could also get higher pound limbs and increase the strength of your bow. It's kind of a nice option to have. Now, the idea of archery in the SCA is one of inclusiveness, like I said. We want as many people to be able to participate as possible. That said, we do want to keep things in the spirit of traditional archery. So while a recurve like this, while a modern bow, does have the feel of something that a lot of people would recognize as medieval. It's wood, I personally use a Flemish twist string for this bow. It's in the spirit of things. What we specifically forbid in SCA archery are modern compound bows. Any bow that has cutouts in it so that you can see right through it like a lot of modern hunting bows do. You are allowed to have what's known as a riser, which is here, which is something for the arrow to sit on and kind of help you aim and guide the arrow off of a shelf. That is all perfectly legal in the SCA because, again, it's about making an attempt at something that could possibly be seen as medieval. If you are more interested in going a medieval route, then some people will choose to use a longbow, which is a single piece of wood. As you can see here, it is one piece of wood, one length. And they're designed in such a way to be more accurate to the period that we're studying, which of course is pre-17th century civilization. And most people, of course, focus on Western Europe because that's what we think of with knights in shining armor and the age of chivalry and all of those things. So with this bow, this is much different. This is a much simpler design than the modern recurve. You'll notice immediately, obviously it doesn't have those takedown limbs because I said that it is one piece of wood. The other thing it doesn't have is it doesn't have that cutout here with a riser. It doesn't have a shelf for the arrow to sit on. So when you're shooting a bow like this, the arrow is actually coming off your hand. This is where it sits. So it's very important to wear a glove on your left hand while you're shooting a bow like this, or else the fletchings will just tear your hand apart. So this is another option, like I said. Now, what I want to discuss specifically today is arrow making. And so when we talk about making arrows, there's a lot of options. First of all, a lot of people will choose to buy arrows from someone that are pre-made, and that's perfectly fine. A lot of times they'll try and make sure that the arrow fits the person, but you can't always be sure. So a lot of people opt for custom-made arrows. And what is a custom-made arrow? Well, bows, arrows, and the archer themselves form a single unit. They are a 3-item team. So what we look at when we look at arrows is an arrow isn't just matched to a person, it's matched to a person and a bow. The equipment has to function with the archer as one seamless system. So here's what I mean by this. Let's say I have my bow here, and let's say that I can draw this bow back to a full 28 inches. 28 inches is the standard draw length that you'll hear a lot of people discuss, because it is generally about the length of a person's arm and their ability to draw that bow all the way back. So we talk about draw length, and it's very important because not everyone has the same draw length. People who have shorter arms will have a shorter draw length, or people with a heavier bow who don't have the strength to pull it all the way, they also may use have a shorter draw length because they can't physically pull the bow as much as someone who's able to get it fully drawn. So number one, you have to make sure that your bow is something that you are comfortable drawing. But number two, the length of the arrow is going to be specific to you. You don't want an arrow that's too short. I'm going to demonstrate why. If you have an arrow that's too short, you draw the bow back, and when you do, the arrowhead might be all the way back here, and that allows accidents to happen. If that arrow slips off the shelf in this case, it can go right through my hand when I release it instead of off the shelf where it's supposed to go. So it's very important that arrows are long enough for you. Better to be a little long than a little short. The other thing to take into account is something known as spine weight. Spine weight basically refers to how stiff an arrow is. So arrows made of wood, and even arrows made of other materials, they have a certain flexibility. Even though it may not seem like it, like, no, it's a stout shaft, that's fine, but you can take it and you can see that it flexes, just like any length of wood would flex. And you have to take this into account, because what happens is when an arrow is shot, it doesn't just go straight ahead. It has this wobble effect that you can see whenever you look at an arrow moving in slow motion. So it's not only going forward, but it's doing this little dance from side to side as it flexes along the length. And it'll also obviously spin like this, because the wind will catch the feathers in the back and propel it down. Well, it won't propel it, but it'll propel it into that spin as it travels downrange. Now, the other thing about SCA archery is we do not allow any substance for our arrows other than wood. It must be some type of wood. A lot of people use cedar. I personally use Douglas fir. It's just what I've always used. And you can find arrow shafts, just the plain shafts, in a lot of places. I go to a place called Sherwood Shafts. I believe Three Rivers Archery sells them, and Lancaster probably does as well. But your shaft must be made of wood. That's the number one. So when you're thinking of making an arrow or a set of arrows for yourself, you have to take these things into account. Number one, draw length. So we talked a little bit about draw length and why it's important for your arrow to be sized for you. So how do you measure that? Well, you can take an arrow like this, which this is a carbon shaft arrow, so it's not SCA legal, but we use it for the purpose of measuring draw length. So you can get a person with their bow, and you can tell them to knock this arrow to their bow and pull it back, and whatever their draw length is, you just move the rubber band to wherever that is. And then you can measure with the tape measure after they put it down how long it is. So have them do it a few times. Come back all the way to their draw point. Zoop, and let go. Have them do that a few times. And just measure each and every single time. Get that rubber band to where their draw length is. So that's number one. Number two is going to be the draw weight. Now, every bow is weighted differently. For example, my recurve bow here has what's called a 40-pound draw weight, which simply means that at full draw, you are pulling basically 40 pounds. So this is a fish scale, and it's a crude method, but what you can do is just attach it to your string, and when you pull it, it should show me when I'm at full draw what my draw weight is, and it is coming in at just about, hang on a second. There we go. It's coming in right now at about 35 pounds, but I'm not at a full draw. So you want someone to help you out with it. But basically, just a fish scale, you fully draw the bow, and then you can just have a friend hook this on there and keep it at about the same place, and it'll tell you the draw weight of the bow. Now, different bows have different draw weights, right? So they mean different things. A bow with a lower draw weight is going to propel arrows only a certain distance. So let's say that your draw weight is 30 pounds. Your bow is going to max out at a certain distance. The higher draw weight you have, the longer your arrow will fly in the air, and the more force it carries with it. So my longbow here clocks in somewhere around 55 pounds. So 55 pounds versus 40 pounds, this is going to be able to propel an arrow much further and with much more force than my recurve bow. So you have those numbers. Those numbers together will help you in determining the spine weight of your arrow that you're going to need. Because again, remember, there's three things going on here. There's the person, the archer, there's the bow, and there's the arrow. So the arrow must be matched to both the bow and the person. This arrow was spined for my 40-pound recurve bow. It is a stiffer arrow than I would use for my longbow because the recurve bow, as we talked about before, has this little cutout shelf where the arrow rests, and it puts it much more in the center than the longbow does. So if I put this on here, I don't know if you'll be able to see it. If I put it on there, it's pretty much straight. It's pointing straight at you. I don't know if you can tell it, but it's pointing straight at you. On my longbow, because it doesn't have this cutout shelf here, the arrow sits like this. Now, there's something called the archer's paradox, which I encourage you to look up and find videos on. But basically what it means is, even though on my longbow, the arrow is off slightly to the left-hand side, the arrow is spined more lightly than this one, which allows it to curve back around as it flies through the air and end up going straight where I want it to go. Again, it's called the archer's paradox. Highly recommend you look it up. But it also goes back to proving the point about why spine weight is important. You want a stiffer shaft when you have that cutout arrow shelf because your arrow is going to fly straighter. When you have a longbow which doesn't have that cutout shelf, you're going to want a lower spine weight so that the arrow can wrap around the bow itself as it travels off the string. Okay, so let's talk about actually building arrows. Let's say that you've got your spine weight. You know, one more thing first. Let me just remember this. So we talked about bows. We should talk about quivers. There are a lot of different types of quivers that you can use. A lot of folks who are new will use just a nylon quiver. I found this one at a sporting goods store. And this is perfectly fine to use on the range, but once you get a little more serious about archery and the SCA, you might want to go a bit of a different route. And you can get yourself a leather quiver instead. And this one is not at all period, but just being built out of leather, I think, makes it a little more, I don't know, makes it cooler in my book. But if you want to be super cool, and you do want to go the period medieval route, you can either buy or construct your own medieval arrow bag. Now, the medieval arrow bag is pretty cool. So what it does is hold your arrows. No, seriously. So it holds your arrows. This part folds down, and this is just linen. I found it at Joann's or something. So you buy yourself a bit of linen. You can construct your bag. What you have in here, this is a wax-hardened leather spacer. This spacer keeps your arrows from getting all tangled up with each other. But this is what they would have used in medieval Europe. And the idea here is it keeps them all separate. And when you need to shoot something, you can pull out your arrow and shoot it. But more than being used as a quiver, this was used to transport arrows to and from the field. A lot of people back then would have just shoved their arrows into their belts, or they would have used this bag as a quiver. And the cool thing about this is not just that it is able to fold down at the top here, but it actually opens at the bottom as well. And archers back in medieval times would have actually drawn their arrows from the bottom, point first, because they're probably going to be using some kind of broadhead. Now, in the SCA, we use these field tips when we're shooting on the range. But in medieval times, when they're hunting or if they're in the military, they're going to have points that are made to do damage. And those are usually broader, hence the name broadhead. So they would have drawn their arrows out of the bottom because getting a broadhead out through the top in this leather spacer, that's going to be kind of a challenge. So they pull the arrow through with its fletchings all the way through out the bag and use it that way. So I just constructed this last winter and I'm pretty happy with it. Unfortunately, I haven't had the chance to use it yet because of the pandemic, but I'm looking forward to doing that sometime soon. Okay, so now let's talk about arrow construction. So you have your spine weight, you know your draw length, you've got all that stuff, you're ready to make an order. Great. So you can get your shafts from a lot of places, like I said, and they'll come to you like so, and they'll have this little card at the bottom. And the card at the bottom will show the spine, the shaft weight itself, like how heavy it physically is, as well as the length of the shaft and its diameter. Now, most arrows that you'll see are have one of two diameters. They're either 5/16 of an inch or 11/32. Adult arrows and arrows used by bigger people, I guess, they will be 11/32 for the most part. They're a little more stout. There's a little more heft to them, just a little bit, but it's there. And kids' arrows and folks who just want a touch of a smaller shaft will use the 5/16. So, for example, these arrows that I made for my wife and son, these were made for my son. He is yellow and green here. These are 5/16 of an inch in diameter, as are the ones for my wife. You'll also notice when I compare these, I'm going to compare them by where the tip is because it's easier to see the fletching. If I can get these all in a line here. You can see that just like the three bears story, you have the small, medium, and large. You have the baby bear, you have the mama bear, and the papa bear. And it's just because my arms are longest, my wife's arms are second longest, and my 7-year-old son has the shortest arms. So that's why these are the lengths that they are. So you have your lengths, you have all the information, you've placed your order, and you get your shafts in the mail, and here they are. What now? Well, the first thing to do is you may notice that they are flat on both ends. There's no points here or anything, it's just flat. So the first thing you'll want to do is you'll want to get something called a taper tool. And we'll use one of my shafts for example here. This is the tapering tool. I have heard it referred to as a glorified pencil sharpener, and that's not far from the truth. But the tapering tool comes with different heads here. So if you're working with an 11/32 diameter shaft or 5/16 diameter shaft, or even bigger shafts, this is interchangeable. You can just swap it out with whatever size you need and place it back in here. You'll notice there are two sides to it here. There's 1 and 2. This side, you just insert the arrow shaft, and again, you just turn it like a pencil sharpener. And the side that I have it on now will give you the point of the arrow where the arrowhead will be. When you do the other end, it'll give you the end of the arrow where the nock will be. So it sizes those correctly for you, which is kind of nice. Now, once you have your arrows tapered, you'll want to dip them in some sort of clear coat solution. We have a tool, it's basically just a giant tube. You just put the arrow shaft down there into the clear coat material, pull it up, and I hang them up to dry for 24 hours. Next day I come downstairs, I retrieve all the shafts, I make sure that they're smooth. If they're not, if some of the clear coat stuff has either raised the grain a little bit or it's just feeling a little bit rough, I will take a very, very, very gentle steel wool and just once or twice brush it all the way down. And then I'll use a microfiber cloth to get rid of any of the residue from it, little dust and stuff. Okay, so once I've done that, I'm ready for the next part. And the next part is painting. Painting comes very soon in this process. It's called cresting, and what it is if you look at one of these arrows here, the cresting is, on this one, the black, blue, and silver lines of varying width. And this design is completely up to the archer. It can be whatever you want. My wife designed her own, as did my son. And you can see that they are different designs, different colors, and they both design them themselves. So these are unique to the archer. It helps the archer be able to find their arrows. You know, if you have 100 arrows sticking in a target, you'll be able to figure out which one's yours by the cresting on it. There's also other uses for it, but we're not going to get into that today. So, when you're ready to paint your arrows, the way you get these nice circular lines here is you can use what's known as a cresting jig. This is a spin right. It's the only one I've ever used. It works great. So the way you use it is you plug it in, of course, and you lift this up like so, and you can adjust how long the arm on this is. So if you have a very long arrow that you're working with, you can pull this way out. And you lift this up, and you rest your shaft right between the two bars here. And you want to make sure this is in line, because its job is to keep the shaft from spinning off the jig. There we go. And you have a little ruler here to help you out and make sure that you really get your lines right where you want them. So this machine will spin the shaft, and it spins it so quickly that all you really have to do is be very careful with your paintbrush. You just lightly place your paintbrush on the wood, and you'll get those nice round lines that you can see here. Now, you can't do this all at once because the paint does need time to dry. So in cases like this, where I did two different colors next to each other and a separate color on top of another color, each color was a different day. I basically, on this one, I did the blue first, I believe, and I let it wait a day. The next day I picked it up, I did the silver, and then the next day after that I did the black. So that is the cresting part of this. After that, once your arrows have all dried, you are ready to attach your first piece of hardware to the arrow. The first piece of hardware that you're going to attach is the knock. So knocks come in sizes that correspond to the shaft diameter. So for my arrows here that I mentioned were 11/32 of an inch in diameter, I have knocks that are 11/32 inches in diameter. So the way you'll want to do this is you line up the arrow, and you got to make sure, you're not going to be able to see it from where you are, I don't think, but the arrow has a series of lines traveling down the length of it. And I really wish you could see this. I don't know if you can. But that's basically the grain of the wood. And it's on each side. It's on this side, and it's on the opposite side. In between that, there is a pattern. And the pattern basically looks like arrows or waves moving down the length of the shaft. So with your arrowhead, you want to attach the arrowhead. First of all, I'll tell you, we use the Duco cement because it holds these things on really well. It's very, very rare that I lose a knock. So you want to line it up with the grain lines that you can see with the Duco cement in there, and then you want to turn it 90 degrees so it really, you want to line it up, with that wavy pattern, and then turn it 90 degrees to the left so that the knock is inside, it's in line with all the grain lines. And again, I don't know if you can see that, but it is in line with those. And the reason for that is the arrow string puts certain forces, all the pressure really, on the knock. And the knock has to be aligned in such a way where all of that force is going to be pushed down the length of the arrow as it's released. And you want that interesting wavy or arrow pattern, you want that on the top of your arrow. It should be on the top and the bottom. And the side where the little index on the knock is, that should be with those grain lines that you can see there. Okay. So white knocks are very common. A lot of people will spring for interesting colors, blue, green, yellow, whatever they want. I'm going to be trying out these guys, which are, excuse me, wood knocks, which are kind of cool. So yeah, I'm going to be using those on my next set of arrows. Okay, so you've got your knock on. Great. You've let the glue dry for a day. Great. The next thing is your fletching, the feathers. So this is a fletching jig. And the way it works is it has this massive clamp and these two very, very, very powerful magnets. you can hear I didn't slap that or anything. It just snaps on with that much force. So the magnets on this are, they actually tell you it's the most expensive part of the whole thing. So the idea here is that you've got your arrow with its nock on, and you settle it into the cradle here. And it's set for different types of fletchings, whether you want 3 fletches or 4 or that kind of thing. And then you're going to take your feathers that you have here. And these feathers are turkey feathers. That's another rule in the SCA, is that your feathers cannot be of a synthetic material. They have to be natural. So these are turkey feathers. Even the green ones here are turkey, but they are just dyed green. So what you want to do with this is there is something called fletching tape. And fletching tape, as you might guess, is used for the fletching of arrows. And you peel off a piece of the fletching tape. It's basically double-sided tape. And you attach one side to the underside of your feather. So you put your feather in here, clamp it down, so it's right there. And all you've got access to right now is the very bottom of that feather. So you put your fletching tape along there, and when you're ready to do your fletching, you remove the piece of film that's blocking the tape on this side. And you take this, you line it up very carefully with your arrow shaft, and you press it down, and the feather will stay because the fletching tape is giving it an adhesive bond to the arrow shaft. Now obviously I didn't put mine on, so when I do, and you can see it like this, so when I open this up, the feather is going to fall out. But that's the idea. So once you've got your feather down, I put a little drop of Duco cement at the front of the feather and at the back to really hold it onto the shaft. So you won't be able to see it because it dries clear, but it really helps protect the feathers while they're in flight and from damage and from peeling up at the front and the back. Because if the feather is going to come up at all, chances are it's going to be starting from the front or the back, just from wear and tear. So you put that little drop of glue there, and it really safeguards the hold that the feather has to the shaft. So, then you wait a day. There's a theme here. Pretty much every step of this, you wait a day. So once you've got your painting done, you've got your nock on, you've got your feathers on, it's looking great. There's just one last thing to do, and that is this, which is the arrowhead. Now I mentioned that we use something called field points, and field points are basically points used for target shooting. You don't want to use something like a broadhead that's made for hunting because you don't want to destroy your friend's targets that they put a lot of work into building. Don't do that. They don't like it. So we use field points, which are much nicer to targets. They punch a nice hole in it instead of ripping it up. So for the arrowhead, this gets the most wear and tear and damage of any other part of the arrow. So you want to make sure that this sucker is on there as fast as possible. I don't mean quickly, I mean fast, hold fast. So we use epoxy. We drop a little touch of the epoxy, not a little touch, I use more than I should probably. Put a little bit of the epoxy in there, or actually what I like to do is I have a little plastic plate in front of me, and I mix it up with the tip of the arrow itself. I grab a whole bunch of it, and then I slide it on there, and the epoxy really makes that thing stick quickly and hold really well. The epoxy that will come out, I'm wearing gloves when I do this, obviously, because you don't want to mess with epoxy with bare hands. I smooth it around the arrowhead on the outside to really add one extra bonding surface to make sure that that arrowhead stays on as much as it possibly can for repeated uses. Now, even with the epoxy, even with everything else, you will have times where you'll be pulling your arrow out of a target and the arrowhead will come off. I'll show you an example. I should have a couple in here. This medieval arrow bag I showed you earlier is actually holding most of the arrows that I have that need some kind of repair on them. Let's see if I get lucky here. Yep. So you can see that on this arrow, the arrowhead is missing, and that is just from repeated use, and eventually the foam in the target just pulled it right off. So I'll repair this someday soon before the next shooting season. And again, I'll do the same thing. I might clean this up a little bit, get some of the residual epoxy, especially off the very tip here. I'll get that off, but then I'll just dip it in and I'll attach a brand new arrowhead and it'll be good as new. Okay. So once you have all your arrowheads on there, you've epoxied them all to the arrow shafts. Guess what? You want to wait at least a day before using your arrows. But once you've waited that day, you have a brand new set of arrows that you can take to the range and be the envy of everyone there, because they will see your arrows in whatever type of quiver you choose to have, and they'll say, "Oh my goodness, those are so shiny. Did you make those?" And you'll be able to say, "Yes, I did." So thank you very much for tuning in. I hope this was helpful. I hope this piqued your interest, and I hope this made you interested in checking out archery in the SCA. Again, there's a lot of ways to do archery in the SCA. This is the process that just a lot of us use for making arrows. This is not a period method, obviously, as we're using these types of jigs here that they wouldn't have had access to electricity in medieval times. So, but they are in the spirit of traditional archery, being made of wood, using real feathers and that kind of thing. But I do hope that this has been informative. I hope that this has been interesting to you, and I hope to see you on the range. I've been Cadfan of the Autumn Wood. Thank you. Have a good night.